My name is Rachel Monroe. I am 42 years old. The last words my mother said to me before a stranger walked through her front door carrying my old medical bag were that I should stop pretending the Navy had been good to me. She said it quietly, the way she said everything that was meant to cut deep and leave no visible mark. She said it to her sister-in-law, Margaret, but she made sure her voice carried into the kitchen where I was standing with a serving spoon in my right hand and a birthday cake in front of me, and I was doing the thing I had been doing my entire adult life, which was pretending I had not heard. And then the doorbell rang, and my mother's 68th birthday party stopped being about her. I need to go back to the beginning because the beginning matters here. Not the part where I was born in a hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, in a city that smelled like salt water and jet fuel, daughter of a man who repaired aircraft, and a woman who believed very strongly that the way other people perceived your family was the same thing as your family's actual value. Not that beginning. The beginning that matters is a Saturday morning when I was 9 years old and my father took me to watch flight operations at Naval Air Station Oceana. And a pilot in a flight suit walked past us with her helmet under her arm, and she didn't look at my father, and she didn't look at me, and she didn't look at anyone. And I thought, I want to be that. I want to be something that moves through a crowd like it has somewhere real to be. My father's name was Donald Monroe, and he died when I was 26. 2 years after I graduated from the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences with my medical degree, and the kind of exhaustion that medical school puts in your bones so deep that you don't fully feel it until about 3 years later when it surfaces as an inability to sleep past 4 a.m. My father was proud of me. He was the kind of proud that doesn't say much because it doesn't need to. He came to my commissioning ceremony and stood in the back, and I found him afterward, and he shook my hand, which was how we were, and he said, "You look like you know what you're doing, Rachel." I said I was working on it. He said that was good enough. He died 11 months later from a heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in Bethesda doing my residency, and I got the call on a break, and I sat in a stairwell for 20 minutes, and then I went back to work because that was the thing you did. My mother did not attend my commissioning ceremony. She said she had a previous commitment. I was never clear on what the commitment was, and I stopped asking about it approximately 6 weeks after the fact. I became a Navy flight surgeon, which is not what most people think it is. Most people hear the word surgeon and the word pilot, and they picture me flying planes. That is not the job. The job is taking care of aviators. You know their bodies the way a mechanic knows an engine. You know what the altitude does to their sinuses and what the G-forces do to their cardiovascular systems and what happens to a human being's spatial orientation when they've been in a cockpit for 8 hours and they come out the other side and they have to exist in normal gravity again. You ground them when they need to be grounded. You clear them when they're ready to fly. You are the person standing between a pilot and the sky. And that relationship requires a kind of trust that doesn't come from a handshake. It comes from years of showing up when something is wrong and making the right call, even when the pilot hates you for it. I was assigned to Carrier Air Wing 5 aboard the USS Carl Vinson in 2008. I was 30 years old. I had been doing this work for 4 years, and I was good at it in the way that matters, which is the quiet way, the way that doesn't require an audience. My commanding officer at the time was a man named Commander Dale Ashworth, who was the kind of officer who moved paper very efficiently and cared a great deal about ceremonies and wore a slightly pained expression whenever anyone under his command did something that created additional documentation for him. I was not his favorite person. I was not unkind to him. I was simply consistent in my assessments of pilots' readiness in ways that occasionally conflicted with operational timelines and that made me inconvenient, and Commander Ashworth did not love inconvenient people. There is something I should tell you about the years between when I joined the Navy and when I ended up on that ship in the South China Sea, because those years are not empty years. And the empty version of them is part of what let my mother's narrative take root. The empty version is, Rachel went away, Rachel was in the military, Rachel came back. The real version is longer and more specific and belongs to me in a way the empty version does not. I completed my residency in aviation medicine at the Naval Aerospace Medical Institute in Pensacola, Florida. Pensacola is not a place people talk about the way they talk about other places. but it has a quality of light in the evenings that I have not seen duplicated anywhere else. The way the light comes off the Gulf water and hits the Spanish moss and makes everything look like it belongs to a different century. I was 27 when I arrived there, and I was still learning who I was without my father's quiet presence in the world. And Pensacola gave me the time to do that, learning in a structured environment, which suited me because structure has always been easier for me than open space. I met a woman there named Commander Sandra Park, who was my supervisor for the first 18 months. She was Korean American, 41, and had been in naval medicine for 14 years already, and she had the particular quality of the very competent, which is that she never seemed to be working very hard, even when she was working very hard. She evaluated me on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks into my rotation, and she said, "Monroe, you have good instincts and bad communication, and the communication is going to cost you if you don't address it." I said, "What kind of communication?" She said, "The kind where you're right and you know you're right and you can't make yourself explain it in a way that doesn't alienate the person you're explaining it to." I said, "That sounded accurate." She said it would become a significant problem in a career that required you to tell pilots they couldn't fly. I spent the next 6 months working on that specific problem, and I never fully solved it, but I got better at it, and getting better at it was what Commander Park was actually after. I was assigned to my first shipboard posting in 2004, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which is one of the Nimitz-class carriers and is a city at sea, 1,200 feet long, carrying an air wing and 5,000 crew members, and a medical department that operates out of a facility below the waterline that is simultaneously impressive and slightly surreal because there you are in an operating room on a ship in the middle of the ocean, and the overhead has a very specific low vibration from the engines that you stop noticing after about 3 weeks, and then you notice it again every time you go back home. The ship goes where it goes, and you go with it, and that is the arrangement. My second year on the Roosevelt was the year I grounded a pilot named Lieutenant Commander Craig Fisk. This is worth telling because it was the first time I made a call that was genuinely unpopular and that I did not flinch on, and flinching on calls was the thing everyone was waiting to see if I'd do. Craig Fisk was a senior pilot with an outstanding record and a following among his peers that verged on legend, and he had been having headaches. He reported the headaches on a Tuesday. He minimized them on the Thursday follow-up. On the following Monday, he reported vision disturbances in his left eye during a flight. I pulled him from rotation. His commanding officer called me and said, with great care and the specific patience of a man who has done this before, that Lieutenant Commander Fisk was scheduled to lead a training exercise in 48 hours. I said I understood that. I said Lieutenant Commander Fisk had vision disturbances during flight, which was a disqualifying symptom until its origin was established. His commanding officer said, "Dr. Monroe, do you understand what I'm telling you?" I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "I understood that there was an exercise, and I understood that Fisk was important to it." I said, "Fisk was not flying until I had an answer on the headaches and the vision." There was a pause. His commanding officer said, "Very well," and hung up. The answer on the headaches and the vision was a small arteriovenous malformation that would have ruptured in flight if given the right conditions, which high altitude, high G operations very probably would have provided. Craig Fisk had surgery at a Naval Medical Center 3 weeks later and was cleared for limited flight duties 8 months after that. He came to find me before he went back to flying, and he said, "Doc, I'm not going to pretend I wasn't angry." I said, "I understood." He said, "But I have a wife and 2 daughters, and I was going to die in a cockpit over the Pacific, and you stopped that." So I said I was glad it worked out. He said he was too. He shook my hand and he walked away, and I went back to work. That is the job. That is the specific shape of the job, the part that doesn't fit on a resume or in a story told at a dinner party. The part where you make the unpopular call and you stand behind it and you are right about it and no one throws a parade and you go back to work. My mother called me during that posting. She called about every 3 weeks, which was regular enough to constitute maintenance of the relationship without being frequent enough to constitute engagement with it. She asked how I was. I said, fine. She asked if it was very stressful. I said it was a job. She said, Rachel, I read about carrier operations. I said, okay. She said, it sounds very dangerous. I said, it could be. She said, I don't understand why you chose this. I said, I told you when I joined. She said, you said you wanted to help people. I said, that was still true. She said, there are ways to help people that don't involve living on a ship. I said, there were. She said, do you ever think about coming home? I said, I'm home here. She said, I mean home. I said, I know what you mean. There was a pause, and then we talked about something else, and the call ended, and I went back to work. This happened repeatedly across the following years. The calls, the variations on the same conversation, the persistent note of worry that I had learned to hear as a kind of disapproval, the implication that a woman who was truly capable would not have placed herself in a situation that required this kind of worry. I did not address the implication directly, partly because I was not good at direct address in that register, partly because addressing it would have required me to say out loud that I heard it as disapproval and that felt like too much to say to my mother on a phone call when I had work to do in the morning. She was not a cruel woman. I want to make that clear. She was a woman who had lived her entire life in a system that valued a specific kind of visible safety, the kind that could be reported to neighbors and book clubs and sisters-in-law as evidence of good mothering. A daughter with a career that could not be explained without inducing anxiety in the listener was a problem. A daughter in a job where the most important moments could never be reported because they were classified or simply too specific to translate was a problem. My mother needed a story about me that she could tell, and I was not giving her one, and so she built one out of the material available to her, which was worry, and the worry became the story. I understand this now better than I understood it when I was 30 and working on carriers and not calling home enough and assuming my mother's framing of my life was something I could outlast by doing good work. You can't outlast someone else's framing of your life by doing good work. You can only outlast it by speaking. I did not speak. I chose the work and I left the speaking undone. And 14 years is a long time for an undone conversation to accumulate weight. The years before the storm were the years of routine, which in carrier aviation medicine means anything but. They were the years of daily sick call and fitness assessments and aviation medicine protocols and the occasional emergency that was not the Carl Vinson level of emergency, but was its own level and required its own kind of focus. They were the years of being stationed in Japan for a while and in Bahrain for a while and on various ships crossing various bodies of water at speeds that civilian vessels never approach. They were the years of making friends with corpsmen and losing track of them to reassignments and finding them again years later in different postings. They were the years of my career, and they were real years, and the work was real work. I need to tell you about the 6 months before the storm, because those 6 months are part of what James Harwick put in front of my mother at the birthday party, what the chaplain's files represent, what was happening in the background of my career without my knowledge. In 2007, I was assigned to Carrier Air Wing 5 for the first time, pre-deployment. The pre-deployment period is when you integrate with the unit you'll be deploying with, when you learn the specific aviation community you'll be serving, when you build the relationships with the pilots that will define your ability to do your job at sea. I was based at Naval Air Station Atsugi in Japan, and the air wing was flying out of Atsugi, and I was doing my work, and I was good at it, and I was also, during this period, apparently being described to a base chaplain in Virginia Beach as someone who was struggling. I did not know about the first call until James Harwick's document at the birthday party. The second and third calls I also did not know about. My mother was talking to a chaplain I had never met about a daughter who was apparently showing signs of difficulty adapting to military service. She did not tell me she was doing this. She did not mention it in our every 3 weeks phone calls. She did not say, Rachel, I called someone. She said, how are you? And I said, fine. And she said, are you sure? And I said, yes. And we talked about other things and the call ended. What the chaplain did with those calls, what they entered into the record, what effect the record had on the decisions that were made about my promotion board, I cannot tell you with absolute certainty because I do not have the full administrative record. What I can tell you is what James Harwick's document said, which is that the notations existed and that they were in my file and that they were there when the decisions were made. Whether they were the reason the board was not rescheduled, I can't prove, but they were there. And they were in my mother's words. And my mother thought she was protecting me. The Carl Vinson was operating in the South China Sea in late November of 2008 when the storm came in. I want to be precise about the storm because precision is how I understand things, and also because the storm was the kind of event that is easy to underestimate. If you have never been on a carrier in the middle of open ocean, when the weather decides to remind everyone what the ocean actually is, the swells were running at 22 feet by the time the storm reached us. The ship was rolling at angles that made moving through the passageways a matter of timing your steps against the pitch of the deck. Flight operations had been suspended. The air wing was secured. The crew was doing what you do in bad weather, which is whatever you can manage and nothing more. The landing cable snapped at 19 minutes past 11 in the evening. I want you to understand what a carrier's arresting cable is. It is a thick steel wire strung across the flight deck at a specific tension, designed to catch the tailhook of an incoming aircraft and bring a 30,000-pound plane from 150 miles per hour to a complete stop in under 2 seconds. The cables are under enormous tension at all times. When one fails, it fails violently. It whips. It moves at a speed and with a force that is not fully describable in language that belongs to normal human experience. James Harwick was on the flight deck. He should not have been on the flight deck during a storm with suspended operations. And the reason he was there is a long story that involves a maintenance discrepancy he was trying to personally verify on his aircraft, and a streak of stubbornness that he has subsequently acknowledged was not his finest professional moment. He was struck by the cable when it snapped. The cable opened his chest on the left side, fractured 3 ribs, and nicked the left lobe of his lung. He was wearing his flight gear, which absorbed some of the impact, but not enough. When the corpsman got to him, he was conscious but losing blood in a way that told everyone present that the situation was not going to improve on its own. They brought him to me. I need to tell you something about working on a ship in a storm. The ship moves, the floor moves, the walls move, everything you set down slides, everything you brace against shifts. The overhead lighting swings and arcs. You are trying to do precise work with your hands in an environment that is actively working against precision. The surgical bay on the Carl Vinson was not designed for the kind of procedure James Harwick needed. It was designed for stabilization, for keeping someone alive long enough to transfer them to a facility that had the proper equipment and the proper staff. What James Harwick needed was a chest tube and a thoracic repair, and he needed it in the next few minutes, and the helicopter that would have taken him anywhere in normal circumstances was not flying in a 22-foot swell at 11:30 at night. So I did it there. I did it with 2 corpsmen who were better than anyone had a right to expect them to be, and with equipment that was borderline for the job, and with the ship rolling at angles that required me to brace my entire body against the table while I worked, using my core and my legs and my right arm to stay positioned over him while my left hand did its job. There is a scar on my left palm, a 4-inch scar running diagonally from below my index finger toward my wrist. From the moment when the ship rolled sharply to port and the instrument slipped and found my hand instead, I did not stop. You don't stop. The instrument went down, I picked it up, and I kept going. The procedure took 2 hours and 17 minutes. James Harwick did not die on that table. When it was over, I sat down on the floor of the surgical bay and drank a bottle of water, and then I stood up and went back to doing my job because there were other crew members who had been injured less severely in the storm and they needed attention. I did not know, while I was doing that surgery, that my promotion review board was scheduled for the following morning. I did not know because I had not been told. The board convened at 0800 on the 23rd of November, 2008, to review my candidacy for promotion to the rank of lieutenant commander. I was not present. I was unconscious in my bunk. where I had been since approximately 0200, having spent the preceding hours finishing my work in the surgical bay. The board made its decision without me. The decision was that my file was incomplete and that my review would be rescheduled. The review was not rescheduled. Not that cycle. There were administrative reasons given. There were always administrative reasons. I continued my service. I did my job. The next review cycle came and I was reviewed and I was promoted, but I was a year behind where I should have been. And in a career where timing is everything, a year behind is not nothing. It is not nothing, and it is not something you announce at dinner parties. It is something you carry in the specific way that unfair things get carried, which is in the body, in the way you hold your shoulders, in the way you close your eyes slightly longer than necessary when someone asks how the career is going. I served for 14 years total. I left the Navy in 2012 when my lower back had accumulated enough damage from years on ships and on aircraft, and one particular surgery performed during a 22-foot swell that my orthopedic consultant advised me that continued active duty service was going to create problems that would not resolve themselves. I was not medically discharged. I was not discharged for psychological reasons. I submitted my papers and I separated honorably and I moved back to Virginia and I opened a private practice and I was 34 years old and I was good at my job and I missed the sea for about 3 years with a constancy that felt like weather. My mother's version of events was different. My mother's version of events was that I had joined the Navy against her advice and had spent years in a high-pressure environment that I was ultimately unable to sustain, and that I had come home because I couldn't handle it, and that my lower back was just the reason I was allowed to admit what was true, which was that the whole enterprise had been too much for me. She told this version of events at family gatherings. She told it to her book club. She told it to the woman who cut her hair every 6 weeks for 12 years. She refined it over time the way a storyteller refines a narrative, smoothing the rough edges, making it more coherent, removing the details that complicated the central point. By the time I moved back to Virginia Beach in 2012, she had been telling it for a while, and it had acquired the weight and the texture of something that had always been true. I want to be honest about something here. I let it happen. I know that. I am not someone who likes to explain herself. My father was not someone who liked to explain himself. We were alike in that way. The explaining feels like arguing, and the arguing feels like caring what someone thinks, and caring what someone thinks when you know someone's thoughts to be wrong has always felt like a pointless expenditure of energy to me. So I did not correct her. I didn't say anything during the 14 years that her version of my career lived in the air between us. I went to her birthday parties and her Christmas dinners, and I sat across the table from her and I watched her tell her version, and I said nothing, and I told myself it was because explaining was beneath me. And I think that was only partly true. I think the other part was that I had heard her version so many times that some corner of me had started to wonder whether she was seeing something I wasn't. Some small, tired corner that didn't have the resources to fight back. That is the part I am least proud of. My Aunt Carol, whose real name is Caroline Delaney Monroe by marriage and who divorced the Monroe half out of her name in 2001 but kept it out of loyalty to my father, is my father's older sister. She is 65 years old, and she has taught middle school English for 38 years, and she understands human beings the way you can only understand them after 3 decades of watching 12-year-olds try to survive each other. She is also the only person in my family who ever said to me, out loud and without qualification, that my mother's version of my career was a story my mother had told herself for reasons that had more to do with my mother than with me. Aunt Carol said this to me in her car outside a Christmas dinner in 2014, which was 2 years after I had come home. She had followed me out because she could see from across the table that I was reaching the end of my capacity to sit still and silent while my mother explained to my cousin's new husband that Rachel had always been a little fragile. Underneath the tough exterior, she followed me outside and she sat in the driver's seat and I sat in the passenger seat, and she said, "You know, she's describing herself, right?" I said, "I knew." She said, "Then why do you keep coming to these things?" I said, "Because she's my mother." Carol said that was a reason, but it wasn't necessarily an answer. Then she handed me a travel coffee mug that she pulled from the back seat, full of good coffee that she'd brought from home because she'd known the dinner's coffee was going to be terrible, and she said, "Drink this and come back inside when you're ready." I drank the coffee and I went back inside, and I kept doing that for 8 more years. My mother's 68th birthday party was held on a Saturday afternoon in October. It was the kind of October day that Virginia Beach does when it's at its best, cool and clear, the light coming in sideways through the windows the way it does in the fall, and the house was full of people I had known my whole life. My mother's sister Margaret and her husband Frank, the Hendersons from next door, my cousin Tom and his wife Lisa and their 3 kids, a woman from my mother's book club named Patricia, who had been hearing the version of my career for so long that she actually looked at me sometimes with a specific expression that I can only describe as sympathetic pity, the kind that assumes the object of the pity doesn't notice. I had brought the cake. That was my job. I brought a chocolate cake from the bakery downtown that my mother liked, and I arrived 45 minutes early, which is what I always do, and I put the cake on the kitchen counter and I cut it into slices because my mother's dining room table was already arranged for the party and there was no room for a whole cake. That is where I was standing in the kitchen when I heard my mother's voice carrying from the living room. She was talking to Margaret. I could hear Margaret's sympathetic murmurs, the sounds a person makes when they're agreeing with something they've heard before and feel is probably worth agreeing with again. And I heard my mother say, in her clear, precise voice, that Rachel had never really been able to sustain the pressure. She said the Navy had been very hard on Rachel. She said Rachel's health issues were the kind that came from pushing yourself past your natural limits for too long. She said she thought Rachel had been medically discharged. She said she thought there'd been some documentation about psychological strain. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment. Not anger, not exactly, something older than anger, something that had been sitting under the anger for a very long time, waiting for the moment when I'd have to decide whether to keep sitting on it or to do something about it. It was the particular weight of a story that was not yours, being told about you, in a voice that had had years to develop its confidence and its authority, and knowing that the truth was in you, but that you had never let it out because you had trained yourself to believe that letting it out was somehow more exhausting than keeping it in. I was still holding the serving spoon. I had not moved. I was deciding. And then the doorbell rang. Carol was the one who opened the door because she was in the hallway, and she is the kind of person who opens doors. I heard her say, "Hello, hello, can I help you?" I heard a man's voice, low and unhurried, say, "Is Rachel Monroe here?" I heard Carol say, "She might be in the kitchen." And then I heard footsteps. And then a man I had not seen in 14 years was standing in the doorway of my mother's kitchen holding an olive drab trauma bag in one hand with my name stenciled on the side in white lettering that had faded but not disappeared. He had aged. They always have. He was 58, which meant he was 44 the last time I saw him, which meant I was 30, which meant we were both different people and also somehow exactly the same. His hair was gray at the temples, and he walked with the straight back of someone who'd spent a career in military service and wasn't going to let the posture go even after the career ended. He was wearing civilian clothes, a dark blue button-down shirt and khaki trousers, and he was looking at me with an expression I did not have a word for, which turned out to be the expression of someone who has been planning what to say for 14 years and is now deciding whether any of those plans are adequate. His name was James Harwick, Commander James Harwick, retired. His call sign had been Hawk, and I had called him Commander Harwick, and in the 2 hours and 17 minutes we'd spent in the surgical bay of the USS Carl Vinson while the South China Sea tried to kill us both, I had spoken to him exactly as much as necessary, which was to tell him what I was doing, and to tell the corpsman what to hand me, and to tell him once, toward the end, when his blood pressure dropped and his eyes went unfocused, that he needed to stay with me because we were almost done and I was not prepared to have this particular conversation with the ship's chaplain tonight. He had said, "Yes, ma'am," and he had stayed. Now, he was in my mother's kitchen, and the olive drab bag was in his hand, and the entire party had apparently heard Carol's exchange at the door because there were people appearing in the kitchen doorway, my mother among them, with an expression on her face that was trying to be a hostess expression and not quite succeeding because she did not know this man and the situation was not one she had scripted. He said, "Rachel." That was all. Just my name. I said, "Commander Harwick." He said, "Retired. You can call me James." I said, "James." And then I didn't know what to say, which is not a condition I enter often. So I looked at the bag, and he followed my eyes, and he held it up a little, as if he'd forgotten he was carrying it. He said, "This is yours. I've had it for 14 years. I've been trying to find the right way to return it. I need to explain the bag. During the surgery on the Carl Vinson, at some point in the second hour, one of the corpsmen had knocked over my personal trauma kit while bracing against the ship's roll. The bag had gone sideways and some of the contents had spilled and we'd worked around it, and when it was over, I had been so focused on finishing the job and then so completely depleted that I had not tracked what happened to the bag. Afterward, I assumed it had been cleaned up and discarded or returned to storage. It never occurred to me that a pilot I'd treated might have taken it. It never occurred to me that he might have kept it for 14 years with my name stenciled on the side. He said he wanted to explain. He said he'd tried to find me through official channels a few times over the years, but the Navy is a large organization and he'd been bad about following through, and then he retired and he had more time to think about things that he should have done and hadn't. And a friend of a friend tracked down that I was in Virginia Beach and that my mother lived in this house. And he had driven up from North Carolina on a Saturday morning because he felt that this was something that needed to be done in person. My mother said, from the doorway, "Excuse me, I don't think we've been introduced." He looked at her. He said his name. He said he was a retired Navy commander and he'd served with Rachel in 2008. My mother said, "I see." She said this in the way she said things when she was very interested and very suspicious simultaneously. She said, "Rachel doesn't talk much about her time in the Navy." He said, "No." He said he understood. He said sometimes the things you can't talk about are the things that mattered the most. My mother said, "I think Rachel found the experience very difficult. I think it took more out of her than she was willing to admit." There was a silence. It was the kind of silence that arrives in a room when something is being said that the people present don't quite understand, but that they can sense is important. I could see Carol in the hallway behind my mother, and Carol's expression had shifted into something I recognized, which was the expression she put on when something was happening that she wanted to watch very carefully. James Harwick looked at my mother for a moment. Then he looked at me, and he said, "May I tell you a story?" My mother said she supposed he could, in the tone of a hostess who has lost control of her own birthday party and is deciding whether to reclaim it or to see what happens. He said, "On the 22nd of November, 2008, I made a poor decision on a flight deck in the South China Sea." He said the storm was bad enough that operations had been suspended and a sensible man would have stayed below decks, but sensibility has never been the primary virtue of naval aviators. He said he was on the deck to check a discrepancy on his aircraft, a maintenance issue that his ego told him needed his personal verification, and that while he was up there, the arresting cable failed and it caught him on the left side of his chest and he went down. He said he knew almost immediately that he was in trouble. He said the corpsman got to him quickly and he remembered the lights above him moving in arcs as they carried him because the ship was rolling that badly. And he remembered thinking that the movement of the lights was a strange last thing to be looking at. He said he was aware enough to know that the surgical bay was not equipped for what was about to happen to him, and that awareness made him want to say something, but he couldn't get the words together in the right order. He said, and then Dr. Monroe was there. He said he didn't remember a lot of the next 2 hours, but he remembered her voice. He said he'd worked with a lot of people under pressure, and you could tell very quickly who was going to be competent under pressure and who was going to be competent before it and after it, but not during it. He said Rachel Monroe was the kind of person who was most competent when things were most wrong. He said he was aware enough at points during the procedure to register that the ship was moving badly, that the lights were moving, that conditions were not what anyone would choose for the kind of thing that was being done to his chest, and that she never stopped. and her voice never changed. And that was the thing that kept him anchored to being alive. When part of him wanted to let go of the effort, the kitchen had gotten very quiet. My mother was still in the doorway. Margaret was behind her. Patricia from the book club was somewhere in the crowd. I could see Tom and Lisa at the edge of the hallway. Carol had moved so she could see my face, and her face was doing something I couldn't fully read. He said she saved his life. He said that without equivocation and without drama. He said she saved his life in conditions that most surgeons would not have managed, using equipment that was not fully adequate, with a ship throwing her around the room. And he said he had known all of this for 14 years, and he had said almost nothing about it in any official capacity because he had assumed she was receiving the recognition she deserved through proper channels. He said he found out 3 years ago from a mutual acquaintance in the medical corps that she had not been promoted on the cycle following the surgery. He said when he heard that, he went home and he sat in his backyard for a very long time. My mother said, very quietly, "What do you mean, not promoted?" He said the review board for Rachel's promotion to lieutenant commander had convened on the morning of the 23rd of November, 2008. He said it had convened at 0800. He said Rachel had been performing emergency surgery on his chest from 2300 the previous night until approximately 0130 the following morning, at which point she had continued treating other injured crew members for several more hours before going off duty. He said the board met. Rachel was not there. The board did not reschedule. My mother said, but couldn't they have rescheduled it? He said yes. He said they should have. He said these things happened and there were reasons and there were always reasons, and he was not in a position to speak to every administrative decision that had been made, but he said he had done some additional inquiry after learning this, and he had obtained some information that he thought Rachel should have. He reached into the pocket of his shirt and produced a folded piece of paper. He set it on the kitchen counter, next to the birthday cake. He said, "This is a summary document from the Naval Medical Center." He said it referenced correspondence in Rachel's service record. He said there were 3 notations in her file from 2006, 2007, and 2008 respectively, originating from the base chaplain's office, each describing a contact from a family member expressing concern about the service member's psychological stability and requesting that the service member be considered for reassignment to a stateside posting. He said the chaplain's office kept records of such contacts because they were not uncommon and because they were relevant to the service member's file. He said the contact was logged as coming from the service member's mother. I did not look at my mother. I looked at James Harwick. He was looking at the counter. He was giving me a moment, which was kind of him. The room was completely silent. I could hear the refrigerator running. I could hear a car going by outside. I could hear my own breathing. My mother said, "I was concerned about you." I said, "You called 3 times. She said, "I was concerned." I said, "In the years before the storm, you called the chaplain's office 3 times and told them I was psychologically unstable and asked them to move me to a desk job." She said, "That is not what I said." I said, "That is what the file says." She said, "I was trying to protect you." I said, "And it went into my personnel file, and it was there when the promotion board made their decision." She didn't say anything to that. I had never heard my mother not say anything. She always had a version. She always had a framing. She had spent 68 years building a narrative around every situation in her life and the lives of the people around her, and she had gotten very good at it, and she did not have one right now. I watched her face try to find it and come up empty. Carol moved through the crowd. She moved to stand next to me, not touching me, just adjacent. That was Carol's way. She moved into position and she let you know she was there, and she did not make a production of it. My mother said, after a long moment, "I didn't think they would put it in a file." I said, "What did you think they would do?" She said, "I thought they would look into it. I thought someone would check on you." I said, "They did. They put 3 notations in my file describing a family member who thought I was psychologically unstable." She said, "Rachel," I said, "I want you to hear something. I want you to hear it because I should have said it before now and I didn't say it because I thought the explaining was beneath me and I was wrong about that. I said, I was a Navy flight surgeon for 14 years. I worked on carriers and in combat support roles, and I took care of people in conditions that most people never see, and I was good at it. And the only time my career was impacted by anything beyond my own performance was the impact that came from your 3 phone calls to a chaplain's office in which you described your daughter as someone who couldn't handle the pressure. I said, I didn't come home because I couldn't handle the pressure. I came home because my back gave out and I had done the work I was meant to do and it was time. But in this family, for the last 10 years, the story has been that I couldn't handle it. And I let that story live because I thought engaging with it was beneath me. It wasn't beneath me. It was my story. I should have protected it. My mother put her hand on the back of one of the kitchen chairs. She looked smaller than she usually looked. She looked her age, which was something she rarely looked. She said, I thought the Navy was going to get you killed. I said, yes. And instead of saying that to me, you said it to a chaplain 3 times. She said, you wouldn't have listened. I said, maybe, but I deserve the chance not to listen. That was mine. James Harwick was still standing by the counter. He had the bag in one hand. He said, I'm sorry to have introduced this at a family gathering. I said it was all right. I said it needed to be introduced somewhere, and this was as good a place as any. He nodded. He held out the bag. I took it. The canvas was worn in a way that 14 years of storage will do to canvas. The strap had a small tear near the buckle that hadn't been there when I last had it. My name was still legible on the side. The contents were gone. Of course, the bag was empty. But it was mine. It had always been mine. He said, there's something else. He said that through some of the same inquiries, he had learned that the Naval Medical Center had recently established a recognition program for medical personnel who performed field procedures in exceptional circumstances, and that he had submitted a formal account of the surgery on the Carl Vinson, and that he had been told that the account was being reviewed. He said he made no promises. He said military bureaucracy was military bureaucracy, and he had been inside it long enough to know that it moved at its own pace and in its own direction. But he said he wanted me to know that the record existed. He said he wanted me to know that someone had written it down. I said, thank you. He said, it should have been done a long time ago. I said, yes, but you're here now. He put his hand out. I shook it. His hand was the hand of a man who'd been flying aircraft for decades, which is to say, it was strong and had a particular kind of steadiness to it. He looked me in the eyes the way pilots look at things they are trying to assess precisely. He said, you were the best field surgeon I've ever seen. I said, I appreciated that. He said, it wasn't flattery. I said, I knew. He left about 20 minutes later. He stayed long enough to have a piece of cake, which Carol pressed on him because Carol presses food on people as a primary mode of emotional expression. And he ate it standing at the counter, and he was pleasant to the people who spoke to him, and he did not elaborate on anything he'd already said. He thanked my mother for letting him interrupt her party. She said, of course, the way you say of course when you don't know what else to say. He picked up his car keys from the counter where he'd set them, and he shook my hand again, and he left. I heard his car start and pull out of the driveway, and then he was gone, and I stood in the kitchen with my old medical bag and the birthday cake and 17 people who were all trying to figure out where to put their faces. Carol said, well, she said, who wants more cake? It didn't fix everything. I want to be honest about that too, because the stories that fix everything in one afternoon make for satisfying listening, but they're not the truth of how people work. My mother and I did not have a reckoning in the kitchen of her birthday party. What we had was a silence, and then a kind of careful maneuvering around the silence, and then eventually the party ended and people went home, and my mother hugged me at the door in the way she always hugged me at the door, which was briefly and firmly, like someone demonstrating that they know how a hug works. She called me 3 days later. I was in my car, in the parking lot of the grocery store, and I answered, because I always answer. She said, I've been thinking. I said, okay. She said, I did not know the phone calls would be documented like that. I said that I understood, but that the calls still happened. She said, yes. She said she had told herself for so many years that she was protecting me that she had stopped asking whether the protection was something I had asked for. I said I appreciated that. She said she was going to try to say that differently to people going forward. Say what differently? I asked. The story, she said, about your career. I said I'd appreciate that. There was a pause. She said, Rachel. I said, yes. She said, do you think he was telling the truth about how good you were? I said, I know what I did that night, and I know what the outcome was, and yes, I think he was telling the truth. She said, I never doubted you were good at the medicine. I said, I know. She said, I just doubted you were able to take care of yourself while you were doing it. I said, and now? She was quiet for a moment. She said, I think you probably were. I said, that was close enough for now. And it was. The recognition program that James Harwick mentioned did eventually process the account he submitted. 14 months after my mother's birthday party, I received a letter from the Naval Medical Center describing a commendation for the surgical procedure performed on the USS Carl Vinson on the 22nd and 23rd of November, 2008. It was a formal letter with the kind of language official letters use, precise and slightly flat, but it had my name on it. It named what I did. It described the conditions and the outcome. It was, for the record, mine. I have the letter in my office, framed on the wall between my medical degree and a photograph of the Carl Vinson that someone sent me years ago. The olive drab bag is on the shelf below the photograph. It's still empty. I don't use it for anything. Some things don't need a use to have a reason to be kept. My Aunt Carol came to see the office when I hung the frame. She stood in front of the wall for a while and she didn't say much, which is unlike her. Then she turned around and she said, your father would have done the thing he did, where he didn't say much, and you would have both known what he meant. I said, yes. She said, I'll say it for him. I said, you don't have to. She said, I know I don't have to. She straightened the frame a half-inch to the left and she said, he was proud before he left, and he'd be prouder now. Then she said she was going to make coffee in my kitchen and she did not wait for permission, because Carol has never waited for permission for anything. And I sat in my office for a minute by myself and I looked at the letter in the bag and I thought about the way light moved on a flight deck and the way a ship sounds in a storm when you are below decks and the ocean is doing what it wants. And I thought about a man who kept a bag for 14 years and drove up from North Carolina on a Saturday to give it back to me. Some people protect you loudly and in ways that control you. Some people protect you by showing up years later with the evidence of what you actually did. The difference is everything. I have been a physician in private practice for 10 years. My lower back is a permanent negotiation between what it's willing to do and what I ask of it. I drink too much coffee and I arrive 15 minutes early to everything and I drive an 11-year-old truck that everyone keeps suggesting I replace. I am 42 years old and I am very good at my work and I no longer allow other people's versions of my history to live in my house unchallenged. My mother is 68. She calls me on Sundays. She has not corrected the version of my career in every context in which she used it, because some things live too long and go too deep to be fully recalled. But she stopped adding to it, and that was something. We are not a family that says much about the things that mattered most. We are working on that. It is slow work. It is the kind of work that does not announce its own progress. James Harwick sent me an email 6 months after the party. He said he was doing well. He said he'd taken up woodworking in retirement and was discovering, at 58, that he had both less patience and more patience than he expected, depending on the task. He said he hoped I was well. He said it had been good to close the loop. I wrote back and said it had been good to have the loop closed. He wrote back one more time and said he thought I should know that he'd gone back to the Navy medical records and the count of procedures I'd performed during that deployment that were later cited in training materials, the cases that other surgeons studied, was higher than I probably knew. He named a number. The number was larger than I had known. I put the email down and I went to see the next patient on my schedule and I did not think about it again for several weeks. And then one morning, I made my coffee and I sat by the window and I thought about it. And I thought about my father in the back of the commissioning ceremony. And I thought about the way the lights moved in arcs when the ship was rolling. And I thought about a man I kept alive for 2 hours and 17 minutes who kept my bag for 14 years because he didn't know what else to do with the debt. And I thought that that was probably the closest thing to a fair accounting that this particular story was ever going to get. A woman named Patricia from my mother's book club called me 4 months after the party. She said she had spoken to my mother's friend Janet about the party, and she wanted to say that she was sorry for the expression she had been putting on when she looked at me, the sympathetic one, and I said it was all right. I said I'd noticed it, but I hadn't held it against her. It was based on information she'd been given. She said she felt terrible. I said she shouldn't. I said the information problem was not hers. She said she had always suspected there was more to me than the version she'd heard. I said there is always more to everyone than the version you hear secondhand. She said that was a good way to put it. I said it was just a thing I'd learned, the slow way. I keep the bag. I keep it because it is the kind of object that tells the truth without trying the way objects do. It is worn in the places where it was used, and it has my name on it, and it is empty now, and I don't need it to be full. I know what was in it. I know what was done with it. That is enough. The truth about yourself is almost never the loudest thing in the room. Your mother's version of you is louder. The silence you maintain to avoid the argument is louder. The years of small compliance, the letting it go, the deciding the explanation isn't worth the energy, those are all louder. But the truth doesn't need to be loud to be true. It sits in you like a metal probe in a chest cavity, doing its work, patient, precise, indifferent to whether anyone is watching. James Harwick drove up from North Carolina on a Saturday morning, and he carried it into the room and he set it down on a kitchen counter next to a birthday cake, and that was all he had to do. The truth had been doing its work for 14 years. It just needed someone to bring it home. What you did in the dark matters even when no one is there to record it. And sometimes, years later, someone comes back from the dark to tell the room what they saw. That is enough. That has to be enough. And eventually, it is.